Take it away, presenters.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Sue Tashjian. I'm from Northern Essex Community College in Massachusetts, longtime OER advocate. So you may have heard a shout out from Marilyn this morning, Marilyn Billings, about the Rotel grant during the keynote. So the Rotel grant stands for Remixing Open Textbooks Through an Equity Lens. And this initiative was funded by the U.S. Department of Education Open Textbook Pilot Project. And the goal was to enhance textbook affordability, student success, and inclusivity across 6 Massachusetts higher ed institutions. So the initiative is a collaborative effort between 3 state universities in Massachusetts, 3 community colleges, and the Department of Higher Education. So the project particularly focused on benefiting minoritized students by providing faculty stipends to develop or remix accessible, inclusive, open textbooks and other OER that reflect students' local and lived experiences. So Devan Walton is an associate professor at Northern Essex, and I'll let him introduce himself in a minute, but he is the author of Culturally Responsive Computing, Introduction to Computer Science, Security, and Technology. And this is a textbook that guides students in exploring connections between computing and the diverse cultures of the world, which Devan will talk more about. And he is also our local AI expert on campus, actually probably the only one doing much of anything with AI on campus. So I think you'll find that interesting. But the Rotel grant was focused, like I said, on accessibility, inclusivity, and cultural relevance. So now I'll turn it over to Marilyn.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see so many people here so late in the afternoon. This is great. I just wanted to say a few words about how we support our open textbooks that are being created. So I'm the coordinator of what's known as the PST, the Publishing Support Team. And so what we do is we have a small, very small, agile, flexible team that, all those words, that looks at the content, does content editing, does review for accessibility, take a look at what we're doing for interactivity elements, multimedia, for the faculty, trying to actually educate them about how making things more interactive rather than the old traditional staid textbook is really what the students learn from and really get engaged by. And so we have a presentation that will talk a lot more about all of this tomorrow at 11 o'clock. So I encourage you all to come to that. But we, some of the highlights of what we look for include, Creative Commons licenses and educate the faculty about that, and do quality assurance for all of the textbooks that we have coming through. That step is really important because it makes sure that all of our end gold products are of high quality as we put them out. So that has been really, really important to us. So more tomorrow. So without further ado, Devan, take it away.
Thank you so much for the great introduction to OER and the Rotel project, Sue and Marilyn. And thank you all for being here. Before I talk too much about the textbook Culturally Responsive Computing or any of the other resources I want to share today, I'd like to introduce, we are all familiar probably with what like generative AI can do. I'm probably more familiar with things like ChatGPT and stuff like that. But one of the things that I'm interested in is how do we design experiences that are like fun, maybe like bring out a little bit of curiosity in students. And one of the activities that I often do when I'm beginning a class, start of a semester, is I try to introduce AI in kind of a fun way. And if you use your phone on this QR code, what it'll have you do, it'll bring you to a little app that I designed for doing introductions. It collects a little information about you, about like what your name is. You can just put your like first name is, favorite animal, stuff like that. And what it will do is it will generate a fun little picture based on your interests. And if you save it, it will post it to a gallery where you can see all the other pictures that everyone else created with AI, as well as what they're curious about with AI. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a quick 30 seconds to do that, that would be, I mean, I think it's a cool way to be introduced to the technology. Uh, and when I was working on my Rotel project book, the culturally responsive computing, that was kind of the idea that I really wanted to grapple with is how do we bring these technologies, how do we bring the affordances of these technologies to students that don't always have the opportunity to interact with these models. A lot of these advanced AI models like ChatGPT, up until very recently, you had to pay for them to get some of the premium features like image generation. Uh, so I've been, over the past couple of years, I've been trying to build applications in such a way that can broaden the reach of this technology to a wider audience. And not just that, but also from like an interface perspective, make it a little bit more welcoming to learners as well as educators. Uh, I think like when you open up Chat GPT, it's like a chat-based interface, right? It almost like reminds you of like back in the day of like Unix style computers where we didn't have Windows and we didn't have all the graphical user interfaces. You just had to type everything out. And I feel like that doesn't always provide the right kind of scaffolding that many users need to really engage with the technology. And I feel like apps like this can uh, help students and educators better realize what you can do with this technology and what the possibilities are. So this is just the introduction app. Uh, the more interesting app that I wanted to introduce today was one app that I developed during the process of building my textbook. One of the issues that I encountered when building my textbook is what do I do about uh, designing activities that really engage a wide variety of both educators and students. Uh, Educators all have their own ways of doing things, right? We all have our own idiosyncrasies and things that we enjoy, like when with building activities. Uh, and if I were to put my perspective on what makes a good activity into the textbook, that's somewhat limiting because my perspective is not universal, right? I don't the way that I think of interesting activities isn't monolithic across everyone. So I was trying to think of a way of how could we possibly support a wider variety of people interacting with my textbook and being able to design content from that textbook in such a way that they could best support the ways that they teach, as well as best support the context of their learners. Uh, and I came up with this what I would call a generative AI tool, but not necessarily in the same way that we might think of a Chat GPT or a Claude, where you're having to uh, manually type everything in. I tried to essentially like pre-program the application with like common strategies for supporting students. Like you give if you run the QR code on this particular program and you test it out, what it will ask you to do is it will ask you to enter a topic. You enter a topic, and from there it generates just a basic lesson, bare bones lesson. From there, there's a series of buttons underneath your generated lesson within the little like canvas window screen that you can use to iteratively refine your activity or lesson uh, based on a set of parameters that I think are like universally useful for anybody, like giving uh, uh, giving ways to increase collaboration, giving ways to integrate glossaries that have uh, maybe language that's more appropriate for ESL learners, or even providing glossary terms in across multiple languages. I think I give the example of translating into Spanish, Mandarin, and French, but certainly that could be expanded out even more. Uh, how do we, buttons for integrating additional technology, buttons for setting clearer goals within the activity, all things that are very important for designing activities and experiences that are more inclusive to a wider variety of learners. And I guess that's generally what I wanted to touch on. I would be curious if there's anyone that has questions about like what my plan was with the apps, or like what is possible with AI, like given like what I've been able to build here, and like what are some possible plans for the future? Any ideas, any curiosities around uh, what we can do with AI? Yes.
Hi, I have a question about accessibility.
Yes.
So I know that there are, we are authoring a book right now in LibreText,
Yes.
our biotechnology faculty. And so I'm curious, we have a grant funded OER accessibility specialist who's going to help
Yes.
analyze the chapters, but is there some sort of tool, AI tool, Chat GPT, or other tool that can be used that would do this for us? I mean, is it to the point yet where there's an AI tool that actually can do the work and take like a book and see what's accessible, or chapters, what's accessible and what's not, and then remediate it?
Yes, this is a good question, right? And I wouldn't say that there is any particular tool that would supplement, or I mean, not supplement, but completely replace somebody that's a specialist in designing content to be widely accessible. But certainly tools like ChatGPT and even Claude, they have multimodal capabilities now, which means that they can essentially take in images. So if you give it scans of a particular chapter, or a particular activity, or a particular page that you're concerned about, it can give you feedback around things like, how is the contrast in this? How is the text size? Is the language used in this content appropriate for whatever your learner audience is? It can potentially complement an instructional designer that's already has a strong background in designing for accessibility. And I think the possibilities and the abilities for these tools to augment our ability to design stuff that is more accessible is only going to increase over time.
In the chat, it says, what is powering the artificial intelligence embedded in the canvas? Is the software owned by a large corporation, but with a paid API?
Yeah, so in the example of these, I am just using OpenAI's GPT-4 Mini to power this. Though, I mean, you could potentially use an open source model. You could use Mistral. You could use Llama. I guess the caveat with that is when we think about closed source models that are owned by big companies like OpenAI and Anthropic versus ones that are open, I always push back a little bit on the open part, because what Meta doesn't do with Llama, their open model, and what Mistral doesn't do is they don't necessarily share the information that they use to train their models, which is an important part of being able to recognize like where the model's biases are. Because like when these models are trained on information, that's where it kind of develop its a sense for detecting patterns. So I don't necessarily think it's inherently bad to use like a closed source model, at least for not right now. I feel like they haven't like crossed any ethical Rubicons just yet that would necessarily push me away from using uh, a closed source model. The other thing is like the comparative cost for using a closed source model. When you get into like the logistics of hosting an open source model and then running inference, it's not really that huge of a gap in cost.
Great. We have 10 minutes left and another question here.
Yes.
I'm sorry if you stated it at the beginning of your talk and I missed it, but Have you put this tool in practice with some students yet? And if so, what experience did you have? Have you had with it?
Oh yeah. So I've actually used this with some students as well as some pre-service teachers, and I've had good feedback. They've in- they've found that it's a little bit easier for them to design content with this tool than with ChatGPT. Because I was mentioning before, the trouble when you're like trying to build something with ChatGPT is you're kind of looking at like a blank canvas, right? Like when you're generating something, you're not really being provided with a scaffolding necessarily of what to do. Uh, and I always tend to go back to like the example of like old text-based Unix command style operating systems versus like things like Windows and Mac OS. Mac OS, Windows, they provide us a lot of visual feedback of what we can and what we can't do and what we should do. When we look at some of these older style systems that were like purely just like text-based, you have to memorize everything and know what to do, what to type. They're less like user-friendly, and it's a little bit more difficult and demanding to actually design content. So with the small cohorts of people, teachers that I've worked with so far with these tools, it's been pretty positive, even though they don't necessarily have the same freedom that they might have with like a pure text-based interface. They find that they're still able to steer the content in a way that makes something that they can use.
I have one more question on the chat.
Yes.
Are any of these interactive GAI tools incorporated into the text or even feeding into assignment gradebook, such as ADAPT, to make the digital text more dynamic?
That's what I'm in the process of doing right now. I'm hoping in the process of one of the update maintenance grants to be able to integrate that more into the textbook. During the writing process, I was mostly focused on doing research for the textbook itself. I'm hopeful that within like a maintenance grant, I can be more focused on doing the technology integration with the textbook. So it's their experience.
Is there a question in the room next? We
Okay.
have another question online.
I have kind of a broad one.
Sure.
They would just like to hear more about your textbook, Culturally Responsive Computing.
Great. So culturally responsive computing was my way to fill a gap in what I saw as like the way that computer science content is traditionally presented. I tried to make it more like narrative focused and more driven by like everyday lived experiences and analogies of how we can connect how we experience the world around us to computing experiences. Uh, and I think the way that computer science textbooks have been traditionally written, and I understand why they're written like this. They're written as kind of like a trial by fire hose to push as many people out of the field as possible, so that you only have like the most resilient people left. Which I'm not really a fan of that like type of ideology when it comes to trying to teach people that have some sort of interest. Like I want to foster interest, try to cultivate it. I don't necessarily want to like put the kibosh to some interest. It's still trying to grow. Um, so that was kind of the crux. So I did a lot of research on different case studies from around the world and a lot of different cultures, and tried to integrate them in a way that would resonate with a wide variety of learners, and most importantly would be resonate with their like everyday experience, I guess, which is something that I thought was sorely missing from a lot of the computer science textbooks that are currently available.
We have 5 more minutes. Any more questions? And at the back.
Thank you so much. I've co-founded and work on a open source learning platform for case studies and modules. So much more, not so much textbooks. And we're finding we're working more and more with National Science Foundation funded research collaborative networks. And they have different topics and themes of interest. But one of the things that's coming up is that that mode of working is connecting our developers very, very tightly with specific disciplinary and theme-based knowledge holders to design learning features that are really adapted to that field. And I just wondered if you have any reflections on that trend of, breaking down the developer, educator, researcher silos, but breaking them down by making stuff together that works better than most of what's out. Like, are you seeing that? Do you have any thoughts about what that and more particularly what the value of it might be for the computer science folks? Because I often feel like I'm asking them to travel to where the tropical ecologists are or the chemical engineers are,
Right.
I just wondered if you have any thoughts along those lines.
I feel like that's actually a really interesting question, right? Like this idea that like all of this new development technology and ecosystems around AI are essentially bringing people together and making it a little bit easier for people to collaborate on new tech solutions that weren't typically possible before. And I think we are seeing this explosion of people that, maybe were once just siloed off into computer science, now being interested in designing education apps and being engaged in these multidisciplinary educational platform development in ways that we just traditionally haven't seen before. In a lot of ways, AI has reduced like the startup cost and the friction for building these platforms. So we're seeing a lot more people get involved, and there's just like a lot more diversity of ideas about like what a learning platform could be, what is learning, and I struggle with this because this is to me like a both a good thing and a bad thing. In some ways, I see a lot of people that want to just go back to the idea of like learning is simply spaced repetition and that's it. You have a lot of people in the computer science field, like coming from like a cognitive science background. They're like, yes, we just have to design a spaced repetition platform and that's it. But there's a lot more that goes into learning, and I think as time passes and we have more of this collaboration will go on, I think you'll have some of those people that have these like more computer science backgrounds that are working on these platforms develop more of an interest and sensitivity to kind of the socio-cultural and socio-emotional elements that go into learning and that make a learning platform successful, that actually get people to stay in it rather than bounce off of it.
All right, we have 2 minutes left. I just want to check whether there's a question online at all. Okay.
The last question I got is, could you share the first link ending in intro? I'm not sure if that was on one of your slides.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, I can just go back to that. Yeah, I can go back to that slide.
Perfect, thank you.
And you have a question still?
Yes, I was in June, I was at the ICDE at Geneva, and I realized that we don't have the same meanings with vocabulary. So my first lesson was AI and open, and there was like a few presenters from China, and open meant that it was online. And they were developing with AI ways of developing as well learning strategies for student success. Now, what was surprising to me is that those universities have just one university has 5 million students. So you can understand why they need AI to manage. So because you talk about collaboration in having machine learning, how we are going to collaborate when their machine learning strategy is actually developing AI for those 5 million students university, which is based on scientific article and not at all about experiencing pleasure in learning. So how do you envision that we can collaborate in training the machines when our initial models are so far apart because of the needs of institutions and countries?
Right. This is an excellent question, right? There's, and I think there's a lot of people even over here in the US that have been very focused on personalizing learning to the point that you're putting children into these silos where you're just uh, watching all of their like cognitive cues and then trying to give just-in-time feedback just to make this tight loop where they're not interacting with any other students, they're just interacting with a machine. And you're losing a lot of learning in that context because so much of our learning is just socially negotiated. And you're right, I think this is going to be a big dilemma in the age of AI, at least for a little while, when you're going to have a lot of people that have a very let's call it a naive perspective on how learning happens, thinking that you can negotiate learning entirely between student and machine, and there doesn't need to be any other interaction between students or instructor or facilitator. And yeah, and I think this problem could be exacerbated if we see uh, uh, certain companies or even like countries that are running national programs significantly pull ahead in the AI race, and they become to dominate the way that we perceive AI and the way that we utilize AI, so that it's less about facilitating human interaction and more about facilitating productivity. So that's a good point. I don't necessarily have a good answer to the question, though. But I mean, I do appreciate the concern. I agree it is a concern that we should all be cognizant of.
Great. Well, we are at time, so please join me in thanking our presenters.
Thanks, everyone.